All right, welcome everybody to Finding Truth. Today we're going to be talking about a very special topic that is related to ID, which is something that we actually talked about this last Tuesday with Dr. Fuzz Rana and also Dr. Saigart. And I am very excited because this time we're going to be talking about ID from a different perspective, which is the fossils record. And today we have a very special guest, someone who I listened to some of his work and also how he transitioned from one point to another. And really, I was really excited to be able to have this conversation with him. So, Dr. Gunter, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience, to those who may not know who you are. Give us a little bit of your background and some of the things you are doing now.
Sure. So, hello everybody. My name is Gunter Bechly. I'm a German paleontologist, so a scientist who's working on fossils, on the fossil record, and an entomologist working on insects. So my special field is the fossil history of insects. I was for 16 years a scientific curator at a natural history museum in Germany. And since then, this has changed because I was coming out as an ID proponent and then had to ultimately resign my position, and are now working for the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, which is the think tank that is spearheading the intelligent design movement, and also working as a senior scientist for the research branch of Discovery Institute, which is the Biologic Institute in Redmond, Washington, but I'm personally based in Austria. So that is a little bit my professional background, and probably we will in the course of this event talk also a little bit about the history, how I came to change my views from Darwinism. For most of my life I was an atheist and a Darwinist, and changed my views towards belief in God and also to intelligent design. By the way, unrelated, these two issues have nothing to do or not much to do for myself. So I changed my views towards theism and Christianity for other reasons, mainly philosophical reasons and historical reasons, for the reliability of the Gospels when I researched these issues. And my problems with Darwinism are on another level. They are purely scientific. I have no theological issues with Darwinism. I personally don't care if I'm materially descended from an ape-like ancestor. And so common ancestry or doesn't bother me theologically. I also think that common ancestry is well supported by a lot of data. But for me, there are scientific problems with this whole theory that claims that an unguided mechanistic process of mere copy errors, which are then received by this kind of selection process of natural selection, that this is an sufficient explanation for the diversity and complexity of life.
All right. So one of the questions that I had is like, how did you get introduced to the ID movement, and what are some of the things that made you reconsider your position as far as like how you used to believe in Darwinism and now you are a proponent of ID?
Exactly. So yeah, that of course relates to what I said. So the history, how did I come to change my views? So maybe two disclaimers. First, one, I already said that my issues with evolution or Darwinism rather are purely scientific, not theological. And the other is that, of course, you have to define this term evolution when I explain why I reconsidered my position towards evolution. Because evolution is an ambiguous term and can mean different things. It can mean change over time, which is pretty much uncontroversial. It can mean universal or more or less limited common descent, which I affirm. It can mean this unguided process of transformation, which is Darwinism or Neo-Darwinism. That is my key issue. And it can also refer to, let's say, cosmological evolution and chemical evolution, the origin of life, and so on. So my basic issues are all kinds of explanations, if they are on the cosmological level, on the origin of life level, or on the level of how did life change over time. All these kind of explanations that claim that this blind process of chance and necessity, of copy errors and natural selection are sufficient. So that as disclaimer at the beginning. So I was from my family background, I was raised totally secular. I never visited any kind of religious education. I never went to church. I was till my late 30s, early 40s, an atheist, a materialist, a Darwinist, didn't doubt this stuff. And I worked at the Natural History Museum in Stuttgart in southern Germany, which is one of the 4 largest natural history museums in Germany. And in 2009, there was a special event, the so-called Darwin Year. And the Darwin Year was a double celebration, double anniversary. It was the 200th birthday of Charles Darwin and the 105th anniversary of the first publication of his book, The Origin of Species. And at the museum, I was responsible as organizer of the largest event in Germany to celebrate the Darwin Year. It was a large exhibition, a special exhibition called The Stream of Life, der Fluss des Lebens in German. And in this exhibition, we showed the history of Darwin's theory, his life, and the core elements of his theory, the evidence for it. And of course, we also wanted to discuss some of the modern Darwin critics and wanted to refute them. And so we had some parts of the exhibition addressing the modern creationist and intelligent design movement. And had, for example, an exhibit which showed a model of the bacterial flagellum to address this argument from irreducible complexity. But I wanted to have something more fun to also, in a way, mock this whole intelligent design stuff. And I thought, well, let's make a wooden balance, a medieval wooden balance. And on one side of the balance, put a large pile of books by Darwin critics, by intelligent design proponents and creationists. And on the other side, just 2 books by Charles Darwin. And then let the balance go down on Darwin's side to, in a way, illustrate in a dramaturgic way that Darwin's arguments are the better ones and the heavy arguments. And of course, for this, I had to buy all these books via Amazon, many of the books of the intelligent design movement and others. And I had them sitting in my office prior to the opening of the exhibition. And sooner or later, I thought maybe I should have a look into this nonsense just to be prepared when we have the exhibition and there are maybe visitors who are coming from a religious background and have questions to know how to answer these questions, what to expect. And then I looked into these books and I was very much surprised to totally find something different than I expected. I expected from what I heard in the usual propaganda that you find in the media about intelligent design, that this is creationism and is about the Bible and about Genesis and so on. And what I found were merely scientific arguments, mathematical arguments, and empirical questions, problems raised that needed a proper answer. And that was one surprise. And there was also this kind of eerie feeling that I felt in a way, I wouldn't say betrayed, but not properly informed by what I had read before about intelligent design, because I felt this whole movement is misrepresented. The arguments are actually much more interesting than they were often claimed to be. And then I researched this more and more, and the more I researched these issues and tried to find answers to these questions, I realized that they are valid problems of the Darwinian mechanism. And then more and more became a Darwin critic myself, and ultimately became an intelligent design proponent myself. And that was at a time, 2009, 2010, when I was still not a Christian, not a theist. I had for several philosophical reasons, already given up on materialism, but I was not a believer. So I had not really an incentive to go public with this and risk my career. But over many further years, I further researched issues, and then ultimately, for other reasons, as I said, came to believe in God. And then I suddenly had an incentive to not longer keep this quiet as an intellectual endeavor in my closet. And I came out as an intelligent design proponent. And this had, of course, then consequences for my career. So basically, within 2 months after my coming out, I encountered suddenly problems in administration to get grant money or permissions for travel that never existed before. And then I heard that colleagues refused to collaborate with me. And this escalated in a way over several months until I was called to the administration of our museum and was very explicitly told that I'm no longer welcome and that I'm considered as a threat to the credibility of the institution. And I was asked to leave. They couldn't fire me, but they made life so hard for me. I couldn't get collaborations anymore. I didn't get grant money anymore. I was taking a large exhibition that I organized about amber, where I was the most qualified person at the museum to do this, which was my idea, was taken away from me. My website at the museum was deleted, even though it had nothing to do with intelligent design. So I couldn't do any productive work there anymore, and ultimately then decided to quit. So that is what happened to me there, and the way how I came into contact with intelligent design. I then contacted some proponents of the intelligent design movement, also went to America and had some interesting meetings, which were again surprising because I found a very open attitude, not at all dogmatic. There were people of very different backgrounds in the intelligent design movement. There were, of course, evangelical Christians, but there were also Catholics, there were deists, there were Orthodox Jews, there were secular Jews. So it was very broad, and the only commonality, there were people who believe in common ancestry, others who reject common ancestry and were old earth progressive creationists. So there were very different people, and the only thing in common was basically this recognition that there should be something in nature where you can detect design. So that is how I came into contact with intelligent design. Of the particular arguments that convinced me, I would say this is a cumulative argument. There are a lot of different lines of evidence, so it's not one argument that alone convinced me. It's this mass of cumulative arguments that really shows that this Darwinian paradigm cannot work. And one is related to the origin of life itself, which of course is not directly related to Darwinism. Darwinism starts when you have life. But the problem is the following: to get this Darwinian mechanism going, you need a replicator. Without replication, you cannot have copy errors, and this Darwinian process of random copy errors and natural selection requires this replicator. And this first replicator at the origin of life, from all we know, was already so complex that it could not originate by chance, just by a chance event, given the probabilistic resources of the universe. So you need something else to explain its origin. You cannot explain it with Darwinism because Darwinism requires this first replicator, and this is even recognized by mainstream evolutionists like Eugene Koonin, who is meanwhile invoking an infinite ensemble of parallel universes to explain the origin of life. And if you already need crazy explanations like this, which is basically a metaphysical explanation at the beginning of this whole process, then why not later when this process has started? Another issue that convinced me is the origin of new proteins. So proteins are the building blocks of life. They are built by amino acids. The amino acids are basically like letters in an alphabet, also about the same number. And the combination of amino acids of the combination of the letters gives then words and sentences. And these are the proteins that then build everything in the living realm. The problem is, in this combinatorial search space of possible combinations of amino acids, the islands of function, where you get functional proteins that can do something, are so separated that they cannot be bridged by a blind search process. Otherwise, you would need very continuous step with little changes in each protein you could get from one to the other. But if they are isolated like stars in the universe, and in between there are large spaces, combinatorial spaces, which are without function, then this cannot be bridged by a Darwinian process. So not even the building blocks of life could be explained with Darwinism. Then, of course, this argument from irreducible complexity, which was popularized by Michael Behe with examples like the bacterial flagellum. But actually, this argument goes back to Darwin himself, who said if you could demonstrate that any complex organ existed that could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So Darwin himself showed there is a possibility to refute my theory. And intelligent design proponents just picked up this suggestion and looked for such structures and found them. And I found this very convincing. If you look at the molecular machines like the bacterial flagellum built by 40 proteins, and if you don't have all the 40 proteins together, the whole thing breaks down. So how could you build it up step by step? Another thing is this information problem, which was raised by Bill Dembski, who has showed that functional specific information, so information has different definitions. So sometimes information is just defined as a string of symbols that has a certain unlikelihood. This is so-called Shannon information. But of course, we mean by information not only an unlikely string of letters, for example, which is rubbish, but we mean something that refers to something else outside of itself, like a string of letters that has a meaning in English language, for example. And this is, of course, also the case for DNA. In DNA, you not only have a very unlikely string of letters, these nuclein acids in the DNA chain, but they also convey a message. They code for proteins. And Dembski has shown that given the probabilistic resources of the universe, the highest amount of information that could be generated by merely random processes, unguided processes, would be about 500 bit. And of course, DNA, in genes, there is more than 500 bit information. And this also shows that intelligent design is falsifiable. Just make a computer simulation, simulate an unguided Darwinistic process in the computer, and generate more than 500 bit of specified complex information. And its core claim of intelligent design is falsified quite easily, actually. But it didn't happen with all the computer simulations that have been done. Never has complex specific information be generated beyond this limit. Other argument that convinced me is causal circularity. So at the base of the metabolism in biology, you have very strange processes that in a way require the end products of a certain process to start the process and vice versa. So just one example, to build DNA or RNA, even you need these nucleic acids like adenine, for example. And to adenine, you need ATP. And 3 coenzymes that are called, you don't have to memorize the name, it's unimportant, but they're called NAD, PHF, and coenzyme A, CoA. So the strange thing is, to make ATP, you need 6 ATP. To make NAD, you need NAD itself and ATP. To make THF, you need THF and NAD and ATP. And to make coenzyme A, you need all 4. So to get something like this going, you need this kind of bootstrapping, which is almost impossible to explain in naturalistic terms. There have been theoretical ideas like the hypercycle or so-called autocatalytic sets, but none has yet achieved to be shown to be a viable explanation for the origin of this kind of causal circularity in metabolic processes. And of course, finally, from my own field of expertise, I'm a paleontologist, I'm working on the fossil record. And so these discontinuities in the fossil record, that the fossil record is not like Darwin, would require that we have these big changes building up over long periods of time by small steps, by an accumulation of small changes over long periods of time. Instead, what we find is bursts of new information, big changes in very short periods of time, almost instantaneously in the fossil record. And that is not an exception. It's a general picture in all groups of organisms over all periods of Earth history, totally contra the predictions, the empirical predictions of Darwin's theory. So that is one reason why Darwin, for example, said in his book a Latin sentence several times. This Latin sentence is natura non facit saltus. Nature doesn't make jumps. He knew when he cannot find a gradual explanation which can explain big changes with small steps, which are all quite likely, then big changes with big steps would require miracle-like events, and he wanted to have a naturalistic explanation. And in fact, nature tells us, no, it didn't happen that way. So that is maybe one of the most important things. Another thing which I'm currently working on myself is the so-called waiting time problem, which is related to the fossil record. And the waiting time problem is the following. If you combine two fields of science that are usually believed to support Darwinism, one is the fossil record, which apparently established deep time and these intermediate forms like Archaeopteryx, so establishes macroevolution, and on the other hand, the so-called field of population genetics, which is the study of the change of gene frequencies in populations. And that is, for example, study of drug resistance in germs in a petri dish or something like that, which establishes microevolution experimentally. And if you combine both, then the claim is if you extrapolate a lot of microevolution over millions of years, then you have the explanation for macroevolution. But actually, if you really combine these two fields and you take, let's say, the windows of time that are established by mainstream paleontology for certain transitions, for example, the origin of the bird feather, or the transition from quadrupedal assumed ancestors of whales to fully marine whales, and you take these windows of time and you calculate with the standard mathematical apparatus of population genetics, if the required genetic changes that are necessary to make this kind of re-engineering of a quadrupedal ancestor into a fish-like whale, are these changes possible in the available window of time? Because the genetic changes have to occur in a population and they have a certain likelihood based on the mutation rate and the number of individuals and the generation time and so on. You can do the math and you can calculate it. And these changes also have to spread in the population to really change one species into the other. It's not sufficient that one organism has the proper mutation. It has to spread. And you can do the calculation, and what you get is consistently in all cases where you do the math is that the time that is available is orders of magnitude too short for the Darwinian process to account for the changes. So these are the most important cumulative arguments that convinced me that there is something seriously wrong with the Neo-Darwinian paradigm.
Okay, so you mentioned you are a paleontologist, and obviously you work
Right.
with the fossils and all that stuff. Like there are a couple things that I have read about like the fossil record, and I guess I have two questions, and I'm gonna just throw them combined. One of them would be like, how does your profession help you understand the issues that come about? Like I know you already mentioned some of them, like the mathematical problems and stuff like that.
Yes.
But how does your profession help you understand that there is a indeed what appears to be like a problem with evolution, like from your own perspective, and then at the same time, how like what kind of involvement or what kind of role does the Cambrian explosion play into all that stuff?
Yeah, that's a good example, and one of the key events, of course, of these discontinuities that maybe people have already heard of. So, of course, in any field of science, if you really want to understand certain issues and you want to interpret the evidence and want to find out are certain hypotheses a good explanation for the available data or not, you require, let's say, a certain technical knowledge that is necessary. So in my field in paleontology, the requirement, of course, was that you are very well acquainted with the technical literature, that you grasp certain, often quite arcane concepts, that you know how to use certain sophisticated research methods and statistics and so on to evaluate the data. And an awful lot of empirical data that are out there from thousands and thousands of localities where fossils have been found. And so you need this kind of professional background, and therefore it is often, let's say, problematic, and that is true for both sides. If people make a case for Darwinism, but also if people try to make a case against Darwinism, when they lack the expertise, then things can easily go off the rails, and they can make claims that are not supported really by the field. And this is the reason that I'm glad that I had this long period of let's say, scientific study and training and working in the field. So for 16 years, as I said, I worked as a curator at the museum. I published more than 160 research papers, have described probably about 180 new species, fossil organisms. And so that was, of course, very helpful when I then made this transition to really have the knowledge at hand to get a new view. And what happened to me is that I suddenly realized when it was like, yeah, I don't know how to say this in English. In German, it's when scale falls from your eyes. So your eyes are open suddenly to new problems that you were aware of the facts before, but you didn't really realize the gravity of certain issues before you make this kind of paradigm change. So when I made this transition and I started to consider even the possibility that there could be something wrong with Darwinism, it really a light bulb went on for me, and I realized the large part of the fossil evidence actually contradicts the core predictions of the theory. And usually in science, when empirical data conflict with predictions of the theory, then you reconsider the theory and you rethink your paradigm and not try to fudge the data to fit your pet theory, which is actually what often happens in mainstream evolutionary research. So this kind of expertise was quite crucial to recognize these problems, like the discontinuities in fossil record, to know, to see that there is not just one example, like the Cambrian explosion, which I will elaborate in a moment, but that there are examples for this everywhere, from the origin of life to the origin of the genus Homo, and the origin of flowering plants, and of placental mammals, and of modern birds, and in the Triassic, the origin of dinosaurs, and the origin of flying insects, and so on and so on. So Cambrian explosion, that you mentioned this, and the Cambrian explosion is probably the key event in the history of life that exhibits this kind of saltational, discontinuous, abrupt appearance of totally new body plans and new groups of organisms. So what is the Cambrian explosion? The Cambrian explosion, Cambrian is a time in Earth history, very early, basically the first time in Earth history where we find animal fossils. It's about Cambrian explosion happened about 537 to, at best, 508 million years ago. But the main pulse was about 520 million years ago. And what happened at this time is that before the Cambrian explosion, the only stuff you find are either algae or a very alien kind of organisms that are certainly not ancestral animals. They look totally alien, have a strange symmetry, a strange growth. Nobody knows what they are, if they are lichens or if they are large protists, or if they are plants. Nobody knows. It's the so-called Ediacaran biota. But no animals at all, also not precursors, not simple animals before. And then in the Cambrian explosion, suddenly, without any transition, without any transformation of simple precursors to more complex descendants, we find suddenly all the different body plans of animals, of so-called metazoans, or bilaterial metazoans. So animals that have this bilateral symmetry, like ourselves, we have a symmetry plane right, left, right, and that is typical for most animals, except for sponges and for jellyfish. And we find 20 of the known 33 metazoan phyla, that is the different body plans, we find suddenly appearing in the Cambrian without any precursors. Body plans are, for example, arthropods, and then chordates, that's a group to which we also belong, invertebrates, for example, echinoderms like starfish or mollusks, and all these kind of organisms which have a very different construction. So, for example, vertebrates are hard on the inside and soft on the outside. They have an endoskeleton. Arthropods are the opposite. They are hard on the outside, have an exoskeleton, and soft on the inside. So they have a very different construction, and all these different constructions appear suddenly in the Cambrian. And this raises two problems. One is that the expectation from Darwinism would be that first you have, let's say, the first living cell, and this makes a population of an ancestral species, and then the species propagates, and ultimately it splits into two species, and these two species diverge and get a little bit different, one species from the other, and over time these differences accumulate, and maybe these two lineages become two genera, different genera, and then they become different families, and after many millions and millions of years maybe they become different orders, and ultimately maybe after 100 million years they become different body plans, different phyla. So that would be the Darwinian expectation. But what we actually find in the fossil record is that, boom, out of nothing, we find all the diversity of these different body plans. And then these different body plans are diversified, and you find then a playing with these tunes of these different constructions. So instead of this bottom-up pattern, we find a top-down pattern, which is the exact opposite of the prediction of the theory. And the other problem is what I already mentioned, this waiting time problem. If we have just a window of time available for the transition from an assumed jelly blob-like ancestor of animals to something like a trilobite, and the earliest evidence for trilobite is 537 million years. And these trilobites, they have this exoskeleton, and they have complex compound eyes, and they have articulated legs, and have a nervous system and a gut system, and so on. All this stuff would have to evolve within the lifetime of only one or two marine invertebrate species. So not the lifespan of a single organism, but the textbook knowledge lifespan of a single species. That's impossible. You cannot make this re-engineering from a jelly-like blob to a trilobite within this window of time. It's impossible. It's impossible mathematically to get the genetic changes in this window of time. So that is the problem that is raised by the Cambrian explosion, and also by all these other similar events in the history of life that I alluded to.
What are some of the theories or explanations that have been given to try to explain some of the challenges that you have just mentioned? And why are they not sufficient as far as like trying to answer these issues? Like I know that you had a debate with Dr. Suomedas.
Yes.
I think it was a few months back, and you know, you were bringing up some of the, like you guys talked about the Cambrian explosion, and one of the things that he said was that, you know, indeed there's answers for that, and you tried to counter by saying that, you know, there's still some issues that those specific theories or ideas do not really answer the challenges.
That's right, exactly. So there have been proposed different explanations, and actually very different levels of explanation. So one level of explanation would be to deny the problem. That is, for example, the approach to say, well, this can all be explained with the incompleteness of the fossil record. And that's something that you often hear when you bring up this issue of discontinuities in the fossil record, that people will say, well, but the fossil record is incomplete. Just 1% of all species that ever existed are recorded in the fossil record, according to estimates. So this is actually technically wrong, because if you look at the statistical tests that we have meanwhile available to test the completeness of the fossil record, then on the crucial level, and what we are interested in here is the level of macroevolution of let's say the family level. What different kinds of constructions do we found? Do we know sufficiently the number of families of different organisms that ever existed in the history of life? And on this level, actually, we can make statistical tests that are based on something that is called the collector curve. And to understand this concept of the collector curve, it's very easy. Just imagine you do collecting, for example, collecting mussels and starfish at the shore. And when you do this at the beginning, you find every day, you find interesting new things, new mussels, new snails, new starfish, new sand dollars, and so on and so on. But when you do this for several years, then repetition set in and you find the same stuff over and over again, and only very rarely something new. And then you know that you have sampled enough that you know what's missing is really missing out there, and is not missing because you were too lazy to collect more. So this approach is used as a statistical test in paleontology. It's called the collector curve. And we know that the fossil record is sufficiently complete in most groups of organisms on this interesting level, for example, of the families. So as an example, in vertebrates, 80% of modern vertebrate families are recorded in the fossil record. And we can extrapolate this also when we look at other groups in extinct groups. We can extrapolate this into all previous periods of Earth history. So we have a pretty complete picture on the level of macroevolutionary differences in the fossil record. So incompleteness of the fossil record cannot explain away things like the Cambrian explosion. A variant of this approach to deny the problem is the so-called artifact hypothesis. And the artifact hypothesis makes the following claim. It says, well, in the Cambrian, something changed in terms of geology. We have layers there that can preserve these pretty soft-bodied and often small organisms, and the ancestors probably maybe were even smaller and more soft-bodied, and in the previous times of Earth history, they're simply the same layers didn't exist for some reason. So we don't have these suitable geological formations to find the ancestors, but certainly they must have existed. So that is, of course, a very convenient way to create an ad hoc hypothesis that cannot be falsified, apparently, to say, well, there were ancestors, but we cannot find them. But actually, this whole approach has been debunked in the past years because we have discovered so-called BST localities from the Ediacaran. The Ediacaran is the time prior to the Cambrian explosion, so-called Precambrian, the terminal era of the Precambrian period. And BST stands for Burgess Shale type localities. And the Burgess Shale is this famous locality in Canada where we found all these wonderful Cambrian fossils. And Burgess Shale type localities in the Ediacaran are now much older localities, which are, in terms of their geology and their sedimentology, in terms of their preservational capabilities, equivalent layers. And we meanwhile know dozens of them. And especially from Mongolia and from China, vast localities with thousands of fossils, and the only thing that we find in these localities are either algae or these strange Ediacaran organisms. So no animals at all, and even mainstream evolutionists admit that the animals are not lacking there because we don't find them or because they could not be preserved, but because they did not exist yet at this time. So the artifact hypothesis has failed as well. So people came up with other explanations, and there are again, if they try to causally explain how could you get something like the Cambrian explosion, there are basically two types of explanation. One is intrinsic, one is extrinsic. That means one tries to explain the whole thing by internal things that are going on in the biological realm, for example, competition between predators and prey and so on. This is the so-called Red Queen hypothesis, that stuff has to run to stay at the same place. So you need this kind of arms race, which would have speeded up the evolutionary process. So that is one approach. The other is external factors, and that is often invoked in the Cambrian explosion, that people say, well, there was a snowball Earth before, or there were changes in oxygen content. But the problem with all these kinds of explanation is that even a layman can understand that only because you have cold temperatures over long periods of time or a different oxygen content, that doesn't create new information, new genes. That may be some correlated conditions, may be necessary conditions for a change, but certainly not sufficient and explanatory sufficient conditions for these genetic changes on this level of magnitude. So these factors cannot explain the Cambrian explosion either. The final and most recent attempt is to say we didn't need new genes and there were no new proteins necessary to get these new body plans. This can be explained either by a kind of Lego brick-like process. We have this kind of genetic modules that existed already before, something like the Hox genes, for example. And there were no new modules, no new genes necessary. Only these modules had to be rearranged in a new way, like Lego bricks can be rearranged to build something else, and first build a car and then build a house. And that is one approach. The other approach is maybe you just needed some kind of rewiring of regulatory processes, so-called gene regulatory networks. Again, no new genes necessary, no new proteins necessary, just some rewiring of pre-existing stuff. That sounded nice. You still find this in a lot of papers about the Cambrian explosion. The problem is this has been empirically refuted by modern research. This claim that no new genes and no new proteins were necessary, for example, by papers like the paper by Pabst and Holland in 2018, or the paper by Hager et al. In 2020, these studies showed that hundreds of new genes and of new proteins were correlated and involved with the different lineages of animals that originated in the Cambrian explosion. So you have to explain how could so many new genes and new proteins, this new information, this new code arise in this short window of time. So all these different explanations that have been suggested either have been totally refuted or they are totally incapable of explaining the really crucial phenomenon, which is the origin of a lot of new information in a very short period of time.
And I think that you sort of already answered this question, but the question that I was going to ask you next is like, as we discover new evidence within the fossil record, what is that telling us? Like, where is that leading us as far as like, trying to understand the past and then some of the issues that you just talked about? Like, where is that leading us? All this new research, all the new data that we're finding.
Yeah, that has two sides, of course. One would be, let's say, on the plus side of evolution. If you define evolution just as change over time and as common ancestry, maybe. So if we look at the fossil record, and this has been with growing research, of course, increased and deepened, this recognition is that the pattern of the fossil record is not chaotic, and that you have a certain order in the fossil record, which is if you go from the deepest layers to the highest layers, so from the oldest layers to the youngest layers, you get a change from less complex to more complex overall, with exceptions, and from less similar to the modern flora and fauna to more similar to the modern flora and fauna if you go up the geological column. So this pattern, of course, needs explanation, and a convenient and elegant and parsimonious explanation is indeed common ancestry, which is why even though there is also substantial conflicting evidence against common ancestry, also from the fossil record, but overall, I still think it's a elegant and parsimonious explanation of the data. So that would be, let's say, the positive side for evolution. Now, the problematic side with what the new evidence is telling us is that, let's say, if we look at these gaps, at these discontinuities, you might expect that these gaps get closed over time when we find more fossils, when we do more research. And that was actually Darwin's hope. Darwin was very much aware that the fossil record doesn't fit with his theory. He said himself in his book that this might be the biggest objection that could be raised against his theory. But he had the hope, and he said it, that over time, with growing knowledge about the fossil record, this problem will become smaller and smaller over time. But actually that didn't happen, and that is telling us something, that in these 160 years since Darwin's time, the gaps and the discontinuities have not disappeared in the fossil record. So, for example, a famous problem Darwin had was what he called the abominable mystery of the origin of flowering plants. The flowering plants appear suddenly in the Cretaceous era, and he knew this doesn't really fit with his theory, but he hoped that over time we will find suitable stuff and show this gradual building up of this complex structure of flowers and the flowering plants in the fossil record. But actually this problem has become bigger and bigger, and the problem has become sharper than in the time of Darwin. So if something like this happens, then we know that these gaps, these discontinuities are not artifacts of our insufficient knowledge, but that there's really something out there in nature that is discontinuous, and that nature is telling us something about what happened in the past, and that the reasons and the causes for these changes in the past were not continuous and were abrupt and sudden, and this has to be explained, and it cannot be easily explained naturalistically. So the evidence that came in the past decades is showing that these gaps and these discontinuities are real. This is interesting because it's not just that Darwin insisted on gradualism. If you look at one of the most popular defenders of Darwinism today, this is probably Richard Dawkins, and he has written a lot of best-selling books, like, for example, The Greatest Show on Earth. And in The Greatest Show on Earth, Dawkins said that not only evolution is, as a matter of fact, a gradual process, but it has to be gradual to have any kind of explanatory power. This means if you refute this kind of gradualism, that you have refuted a core element of the theory and basically debunked the whole thing, which is why people don't really like the inconvenient facts from paleontology. And to understand why gradualism is so crucial for Darwinism, Dawkins gave a very nice metaphor that explains this very well. He said, well, imagine you stand in front of a cliff at the ocean and you want to reach the top of the cliff. Now, the cliff is steep, it's a vertical wall, and you cannot jump on top of the cliff. That shall illustrate the problem to create a new organ, something complex. It would be a miracle-like process to make this from zero to, let's say, an eye or a feather. But Dawkins said, well, but on the backside of the cliff, there's a gentle slope of the mountain with a lot of steps, and there you can walk step by step on the top of the mountain, and you can reach the mountain without making a big jump. So that shall illustrate this gradual evolutionary process where every step has a certain likelihood. It's not totally impossible that it happens by accident, and the accumulation of many of these small steps then get you from no eye to an eye, or from a scale to a feather, and so on. So, but if it's shown that this doesn't work and that it's mathematically impossible in the available windows of time, then basically this whole thing is refuted, and it's shown that we need some kind of paradigm change in the in biology and in the history of life, because these saltations, they tell us something. They suggest that there is something else going on, some kind of teleological process, not theological process necessarily, but teleological, which means goal-directed, a process that has some kind of planning towards an end involved, that there was information infused from outside of the system, because that is not a gap of the God of the gaps argument to say, well, we don't understand how evolution works, how the saltation came about, therefore God. No, it's an argument to the best explanation from what we do know, how this network of causes and effects works everywhere in the universe where we observed it. And we know that certain effects where you have these sudden increases of new information, sudden increases of specified structures, they always correlate with the activity of a conscious mind. And therefore, invoking this kind of cause to explain these saltations is an inference to the best explanation, not a God of the gaps argument. So that is what the fossil record is telling us.
And again, it seems like you already anticipated this question, but there's a lot of people that I have interacted with and talked to them about the ID movement and things like that, and some of them have a scientific background. And one of the things that they say is that ID in itself is not like science; it's pseudoscience. What would you say to somebody like that? Because I'm pretty sure you have encountered that as well. Obviously,
yeah, definitely, a lot. That's something that most often you hear when you, let's say, present something like this, and you have scientists and Darwinists in the auditory. They say, well, but intelligent design is not science, or it's not falsifiable. It really gets hilarious when they say, well, it's false, but it's not falsifiable, or it has been debunked, but it's not falsifiable, which is, of course, self-contradictory. The main problem is that only because somebody is a scientist doesn't make him qualified to estimate what is science, because what is qualifying as science is not decided by scientists. It's also, of course, not decided by judges, as it happened in the United States when this famous Dover trial happened, where Judge Jones ruled intelligent design is not science. Well, that's not the job of judges at a court to decide. That's a philosophical question, a question of philosophy of science, and it's philosophers of science who should define what qualifies as science and what not. And the problem is, and you are probably more into philosophy than I am, so you know that there is no consensus among philosophers of science about a so-called demarcation criterion. So every criterion that has been suggested to distinguish between science and non-science either allows too much, and you would get, let's say, horoscopes and homeopathy as science, or it excludes too much and would, let's say, throw out intelligent design, but also Darwinian evolutionary biology or quantum mechanics or string theory from science. So there is no consensus among the only group of people, academics, who judge what is science and what is not science. So the claim intelligent design is not science is a very bold claim to make, and you would have to establish this with peer-reviewed sources, and well, I wouldn't hold my breath to get very substantial evidence to show that intelligent design doesn't qualify as science. Actually, there were atheist philosophers who acknowledged that intelligent design qualifies as science in their view. For example, Bradley Monton, who has written a book called Seeking God in Science, who is himself an atheist, who doesn't believe that intelligent design is right, but he thinks that intelligent design is a valid scientific endeavor and has to be decided on the basis of the evidence and not by excluding it a priori as that's not science, we don't have to think about it. Same with Thomas Nagel, famous philosopher who has affirmed the scientific status of intelligent design theory. So the criteria that is most often used to distinguish, let's say, between pseudoscience or non-science and science is, of course, this issue of testability, that you can at least theoretically distinguish between false hypothesis and correct hypothesis by asking nature and looking for empirical experiments that then can show either the hypothesis is wrong or it's correct. And actually, intelligent design does this. Intelligent design proponents did make predictions prior to the fact, for example, about junk DNA not being junk, but being functional long before it was found by the so-called ENCODE project, that indeed the so-called junk DNA is not a leftover of a blind evolutionary process, but actually all the junk in the DNA has function and works as a kind of operating system to regulate these different genes. And intelligent design also makes falsifiable predictions. As I already said, just make an experiment with a computer simulation that creates more than 500 bit of specified information, and you have debunked the core claim of intelligent design theory. So it's falsifiable, it makes predictions, and therefore fulfills at least the same criteria as Darwinian biology, but because we also have to be aware that there are different branches of science. There are historical sciences that make hypotheses about singular events in the past based on a kind of forensic reasoning where you use evidence to make best inferences to the best explanation of the evidence. That's very different to physics, where you can do, let's say, you study repeatable processes and you make these kind of experiments that give you then evidence for law-like processes. But ultimately, I would say, also this question, is intelligent design science or is it not science, is also uninteresting. We want to know, is it true or is it not, and not is it fulfilling some arbitrary criterion of philosophy of science. If there's sufficient evidence that it's true and that it's the best explanation, then it's the best explanation if it is science or not.
All right, and with that, we're gonna go to the Q&A, and there's quite a few questions in the chat.
That's great.
And, before we go to the Q&A, I just wanted to give you some time to recommend some resources for whoever comes across this video, and if they want to hear a little bit more about it, why don't you go ahead and give us some of them.
So, main resource, there is of course a lot out there, and today with the internet and Google and YouTube, you can find a lot. The problem is a little bit to distinguish the nonsense, if I may say it like this, bullshit from the good stuff, and that is true for both sides of the debate. So it's not so easy to if you're a layman, to recognize is something valid argument, valid evidence, or is it some kind of biased thing, or selecting only the supporting evidence and not telling about the conflicting evidence. So I would recommend, from my estimation, that they are good sources are books, for example, by Stephen C. Meyer, that would be books like Signature and the Cell, which is a very good introduction into intelligent design theory and main reasoning, also these issues. Is it science? What kind of predictions does it make? Then Darwin's Doubt, also by Stephen Meyer, which has as main issue this Cambrian Explosion thing and how could new body plans originate. And his most recent book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, which then also includes evidence from cosmology and physics towards teleological explanations in terms of a divine creator. There are, of course, other books from the intelligent design movement, very well known, probably Michael Denton, with his updated book, Evolution, Still a Theory in Crisis, which I would warmly recommend. Michael Behe, famous design proponent, with his books Darwin's Black Box, where he introduced this concept of irreducible complexity with the bacterium flagellum. The Edge of Evolution, also by Michael Behe, where he introduces this waiting time problem, very interesting, and which had a big influence on me. And his recent book, Darwin Devolves, where he shows that nearly in all cases where we can show that some kind of Darwinian process is at work, it's not the generation of new information, but rather the destruction of already existing information. Therefore, Darwin devolves. Douglas X has written a very good book called Undeniable, where he introduces the reasoning behind this problem of new proteins. And Jonathan Wells has an updated version of his Icons of Evolution, which is called Zombie Science, about many of these alleged textbook examples that apparently support Darwinian evolution and which have been meanwhile debunked, like Haeckel's embryos, which turned out to be a hoax. And on the internet, if you go to Evolution News, you find recent articles always on recent findings of science from an ID perspective. There's a podcast called ID the Future, which I can recommend, where you also find stuff by me, as in Evolution News as well. And Discovery Institute has a YouTube channel called Discovery Science, where you find a lot of videos introducing different arguments against Darwinian evolution and for intelligent design. For the other side of the debate, of course, there's a lot out there, and you can look at the stuff by if you really want to look at books from hardcore Darwinists and look at their arguments, which you should, and then make up your mind, is books by like Jerry Coyne, Why Evolution is True, or by the books by Richard Dawkins. And then ultimately you have to make up your mind and weigh the evidence and decide yourself which side you find more convincing.
All right, and with that, thank you so much, Dr. Gunter. So I would like to thank you for being here, obviously, and for taking the time to do the Q&A, and all of you guys who are here watching this. I'll thank you for the time that you have spent here and for your questions. I do want to give a disclaimer before we go into this, because I think that there's one or two questions that are gonna kind of like, it covers a certain different perspectives from a Christian worldview.
Right.
And that is to say that this channel doesn't represent just me, but it represents a lot of other people that are involved within this project. And I myself, I'm a proponent of the ID movement, but there's other people within our movement that are, that they're young Earth creationists, and so therefore, like, there's some things that they may disagree with. But all of us have agreed that we do have to put this information for other Christians to listen to, and then at the same time, let them decide where they think they fall, rather than just keeping them within a certain view and they don't get to hear the other side. So this is what we want.
That's a good approach. Yeah.
Right. So this is like kind of like the project that we have been doing since I think November. We have brought different people from different backgrounds, Hugh Ross, people from Answers in Genesis, and we had a conversation between Dr. Rana and Sygart last Tuesday about evolution and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So with that, I just want to say that some of the questions that I might ask come from maybe from a different Christian perspective.
No problem. I'm open to all sides. I invite questions from Darwinists, from young Earthers, whatever. So that makes it also more fun.
All right. So this question is from Brendan, and I'm going to put it right here on the screen. And he is asking, what is it within the fossil record or otherwise that convinces Dr. Bechly of universal common ancestry, representing a tree of life opposed to the orchid of life biblical kind?
Right. So first I have to say, even though I still affirm common ancestry, I'm also one of those people who would say there is substantial evidence against common ancestry as well. So I would be totally open to change my mind on this issue if these conflicting evidence would accumulate to a level where I would say the best explanation would be something like special creation. I have no problems with it. So, but I think currently the best explanation for the evidence is still common ancestry. So why? One is what I already alluded to, is this kind of order in the fossil record, which needs some kind of explanation. Why are the fossils getting more and more similar to the modern flora and fauna the further up I go in the geological column? This would imply, which of course is not impossible, that God has some reason or some intrinsic factors why each creation would become more similar to the modern ones in a book book chapter that I recently co-authored with Steve Meyer. It's a book about theistic, or better, against theistic evolution. We made some suggestions. How could we explain this kind of pattern without invoking common ancestry? But still, common ancestry is an elegant explanation to explain why do you have this kind of growing similarity if you go up in time. But the main reason why I'm convinced by common ancestry is that the assumption of common ancestry can make certain predictions, empirical predictions, very specific predictions, that then can be tested with new evidence and that were successful, and these predictions would not have been possible based on the alternative, which would be explained by common design. So I give you an example. About 10 years ago, there was a publication about spiders, the fossil history of spiders, evolution of spiders. And people looked at the tree that was constructed where spiders should sit in the tree of life based on comparison of genomes and of morphology. And they predicted, because all the branches that are below the spiders, they have a kind of tail. Think of scorpions, they have this kind of tail. And there are other groups of arachnids, of spider-like insects, which have this kind of annulated filamentous tail. But spiders don't. And not only don't they have it as adults, they don't have it as embryos. There's no genetic evidence that they ever had a tail. And there were no fossils that they ever had a tail. But those people predicted that there should have been ancestors of spiders that look like spiders, that have spinnerets, that have the unique features of spiders, but that still had a tail, because that is the most parsimonious interpretation of the tree that has been reconstructed. And lo and behold, only 2 or 3 years ago, in the Burmese amber, which is dated about 100 million years ago, they found spiders with spinnerets and with a tail that didn't exist before in the fossil record or in recent spiders. So that was a uniquely fulfilled, very specific prediction that is exclusively, in my view, possible based on this assumption of common ancestry. And stuff like this happened in my own research, where I could propose a certain copulatory apparatus in dragonflies. Dragonflies have this unique mating wheel where the male and the female couple and make this heart-shaped mating structure. And I suggested, based on the reconstructed tree of dragonflies, that there should have existed a certain type of apparatus that is totally unknown to date, very different to anything known today, very different to anything known in the fossil record. And lo and behold, some years later, we found fossils from the Jurassic that exactly confirmed this prediction. So if theories are able to make this kind of successful empirical predictions, then this gives you some pause, and you have to acknowledge then this is a successful theory in this field, at least. And any alternative would at least have to have the same explanatory power and would have to be able to make the same successful predictions. And that's something where I don't see yet any of the common design alternatives that would involve special creation that would have the same predictive power than the common descent hypothesis. That's the reason why I still affirm common descent. But I also have to say, it's a relatively uninteresting issue. If, let's say, as a Christian, and we believe that God ultimately is the creator of the world and of everything that we see, if God uses dead matter to create something new out of nothing or out of the dust of the earth, or if he uses living matter to transform it into something else, is basically not an issue for an all-powerful God. So we can let the evidence decide, and I think currently the evidence prefers common descent.
Okay, so with that, I think it's very interesting, how you close that, the answer to that question. Here's a question from Otangelo. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's very much involved with with these types of
friends on Facebook.
conversations. So Otangelo starts his question. It's going to be a 3-part. So he says, if Dr. Bechly believes in common ancestry, and then he says the DNA replication machinery is not homologous in the 3 domains of life. The bacterial core, ribosome, and enzymes do not share a common ancestor with the analogous components and eukaryotes
And archaea.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so then
true.
he asks the following question: how do you explain that?
Yes. So first, I would say I don't explain it at all, because genetics or molecular biology is not my field. I usually stay out of fields where I'm not, which are outside of my expertise. So, but I'm aware that there are, let's say, different variations of the genetic code and also of the replication mechanisms. There has also been and that would be my explanation, basically. By still upholding most part of the common descent hypothesis, is that even in mainstream evolutionary biology, there has been some debate if there is really universal common descent up to the level of these 3 domains, which would be the eukarya, that is the groups which have a nucleus in the cell where we belong to, the archaea, which is these extremophile bacteria that live in deep sea hydrothermal vents or in volcanic lakes, and the normal bacteria that we know. These 3 domains have these different types, and there have been mainstream evolutionists like Carl Woese who have suggested that maybe they originated separately, or at least not from a cellular common ancestry. Maybe there were some pre-metabolizing, pre-life structures and some pre-genetic structures that came together 3 times independently. So it is well possible that common descent breaks down on this level at the very base of the tree of life, that there are 3 different domains. That wouldn't invalidate the evidence, let's say, for common ancestry of mammals or of metazoans or even of eukaryotes. So that would be my answer to this question.
So I do have another question from Otangelo, and this one,
yes.
It's also kind of like, this has to do more with I guess the different views of Genesis and how you interpret all that stuff. But basically, essentially what he's saying is that the view that you have described, that you adopt, is counterproductive to the Christian worldview, and it raises the question: why do you put science first and not the Bible?
Yeah, my answer, that is a little bit the kind of reasoning that is also proposed by Answers in Genesis, by saying, do you trust God's word, who is infallible, or do you rather trust man's word, which is infallible? The problem is, and that might at first offend somebody, unless you really think about it, is we don't have the infallible word of God. What we have is the fallible human interpretation of the infallible word of God. So we know that certain parts of scripture require interpretation. Nobody disputes that, for example, Revelation requires interpretation. What do these symbols mean? So if we look at Genesis, and this has been also discussed a lot by other ministries that rather, let's say, have this old earth creationist background, like Reasons to Believe, is that within scripture, within Genesis, we have evidence that at least large parts of this, the stories that are told there are not meant to be understood in a literalistic way. That doesn't mean that they are made up, that they are completely fantasy, but that means that they have, that the message that they convey is not necessarily the superficial literal elements of the story. And this should be very clear if we look, let's say, that God is walking through the Garden of Eden. Do you really mean that God had legs and that he walked through the Garden of Eden? No, of course not. That is a metaphor that God dwelled with the first pair with Adam and Eve, like in a temple, as it is later said that God dwelled in the temple, in the Solomonic temple. So there are, if you look at, for example, the flood account, and you look at how the ark is described, there is a reason why we have in the ark one door, and it's only one door that saves. And later Jesus says, well, I am the door, and nobody comes to the Father but by me. These kind of foreshadowings of the message that we later find in the New Testament, that we find in the Old Testament and in Genesis, they are often much more subtle than interpreting the flood story as a floating zoo in a worldwide flood. So I am rather inclined to follow interpretations like those of Mike Heiser or John Walton, who say, if we look at the literary structure of Genesis, which is quite unique, if we look at the way how this is composed with these three different sections of days, where first a realm is created and then it is filled with either animals or with man. There seems to be a pattern that rather suggests that the message is everything was created by God. God wanted to establish a relationship with humans. He wanted to have humans as kinds of priests in a temple where God dwells together with humans. And this is framed in a kind of story that was understandable for people 2,500 years ago. And it is obvious that God didn't want to update the scientific knowledge of ancient Near East people. He didn't tell them about quantum mechanics or about nuclear physics or about organic chemistry. The message was something else, and was something that is, let's say, more timeless and more important than how exactly new life was created. If you look at Genesis, it doesn't say that God directly created the plants and animals. It says, let the earth bring forth, and that leaves quite some room for interpretation if this is a direct special creation, or if it is rather a guided process with secondary causes involved. So I would disagree with Ortangelo that this is, let's say, undermining Christianity. It is undermining a certain very literalistic interpretation of Genesis that is actually foreign to the history of Christianity. This kind of interpretation of Genesis that we find in the modern young earth creationist movement started basically 150 years ago, and very much influenced by developments in America. And if you look at church fathers like Augustine or Origen, who were completely fine with interpreting the days as not literal in Genesis, for example, it is not that the issue of how should this interpreted, is it really literal, is just influenced by science. So why do you value science higher than scripture? That was discussed 1,000 years ago already, totally independent of scientific findings, because of internal evidence from the actual scripture.
Okay. So I don't have any more questions, but I did want to ask you one.
Yes.
In terms of like, whenever you started to adopt the ID view, at least trying to take it seriously,
Right.
and then how did that? And I know that in some sense it's not truly related, but like, how long did it take you to become a Christian, and why did you decide to become a Christian rather than
yes,
say a
like
Jewish
a Muslim
person or a
or
Muslim?
Yeah. It had nothing to do with the ID thing. So my journey away from materialism and atheism started actually by an interest in popular physics. And I started to read books like a book by Brian Greene about the Big Bang and about quantum theory and the different interpretations of quantum mechanics. And I encountered certain problems, more or less philosophical and metaphysical problems, with modern physics that relatively soon showed me that materialism cannot explain many of the phenomena that we find in nature. And that brought me on a kind of philosophical, spiritual journey that led over many years and over many different views that I held in this time. So for a long time, I was holding to some kind of Whiteheadian process philosophy, which is a non-materialist, but still kind of naturalist view, and then idealist positions. And I ultimately recognized in each of these views certain internal inconsistencies, and I wanted to find a consistent worldview that can explain everything and also explain consciousness and free will and so on, and ultimately came to the conclusion that against my predispositions and actually against my preferences, that classical theism is the best explanation. And then, of course, the question is, could some of the mainstream religions be actually true? And then I explored the evidence for the different religions, and I read about Islam, I read about Christianity, I watched a lot of debates on YouTube of Christian apologists, William Lane Craig and many others, and then also read the academic literature about the problems and the arguments that are invoked, and ultimately came to the conclusion that the historical evidence is in favor of Christianity. But I would say this is a graded certainty. So I'm 100% or almost 100% certain that materialism is wrong. I would say I'm very certain, can't really put a number on it, but let's say 85% or 90% certain that some kind of theism in the broadest sense is true. For Christianity, I would say maybe it's 55 or 60 or 65%. I'm more certain than not that the Gospels are historically reliable and that the evidence for the resurrection is reliable. But I would be open for still for conflicting evidence. If it's come in, I would still be open to change my views. I never had this kind of spiritual experience or this kind of direct experience of God or of this personal relationship with Jesus on an intellectual level, but not on a level where I could say this is sufficient, as some people say, well, they have this inner witness of the Holy Spirit to be sure beyond any doubt that Christianity is true. No, I'm an evidentialist. So if I look at the evidence, I think it's rather true than not, but I would be open if conflicting evidence accumulate to give it up. So I'm a reluctant Christian, but I'm 100% certain anti-materialist and a quite certain theist.
Right. And with that, I don't think we have any more questions. Is there anything that you want to leave us with as far as like your final thoughts?
Well, I think we have covered almost everything. Maybe the only thing left is some people may think, well, what should I do, especially if they are students in biology, or how should they act also with these issues of career involved. So my recommendation to anyone from either side of the debate would be stay curious to find out what is really true. Explore the evidence yourself, and not just from one side, but from both sides, and don't believe what the other side tells of the other side. So don't believe only answers in Genesis when they say all those Darwinists are evil people deceived by the devil trying to get you into hell. And don't believe the Darwinists who tell you we figured everything out and there are no problems and there is no debate and evolution is proven. Look at the actual literature by the intelligent design proponents and read their arguments from their position and how they frame it. And then make up your mind. And if you're a biology student, don't be outspoken about this too early, because otherwise it could be ending in a way that you become rather a taxi driver than a biologist. So keep it to yourself until you have a relatively secure job, and then you can if you are convinced by intelligent design, try to find some design approach and discover something new and contribute to the field. And if not, then it's still no reason to give up on God and on Christianity, because there are a lot of Christians who are fine with evolution and to reconcile an evolutionary view with their Christian views. So also this is not an either or. So stay curious, stay skeptical of either side, and be result open. Be open to change your mind based on the evidence.
All right, and with that, I thank you all for being here this morning. And I was going to say tonight because I'm usually streaming during the nighttime over here. But thank you all for being here, and I really appreciate the fact that you all took the time to be here. And we'll see you guys until next time.
So thank you for having me. Bye-bye. Take care, everybody, and God bless.
Amen.